Okay, recording in progress. Good day. My name is Thabelo David, and
My
today my
name is
partner and I
David,
are going to be discussing stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, and racism.
and my name is David Tavares, and I am also going to be discussing the topic of racism, prejudice, discrimination, and bias. And thank you for tuning in today to watch our presentation.
Alrighty, so this is our introduction. So we're going to explore a set of really powerful topics that may sound uncomfortable, but it's important for us to all know and understand these concepts so we can become better human beings to one another. And it also helps us to be educated, and it's a great step towards awareness and change. So, an overview of the topics that we're going to be discussing bias and attribution theory. This basically explains how our brains work and how we are wired to just automatically make up assumptions. We're going to be defining stereotypes, how they're formed, and how they're often reinforced in our society. They're very prevalent in our day to day life, and some people just don't notice them. We're going to discuss prejudice. We're going to look at how stereotypes can evolve into prejudicial attitudes, the emotional reactions we have towards people based on based on their group membership. We're also going to discuss discrimination, how prejudice leads to action. So discrimination is the action, but we're going to go further into it in the topic. We're also going to briefly discuss white privilege, and we're going to highlight studies from Peggy McIntosh, and she just did some work on white privilege. We're also going to examine racism, covert and overt racism. We're also going to explore consequences of racism and how it is harmful to human beings and their mental health and their surrounding. We also have a case study towards the end, which will um, give you guys an idea of how you need to apply these topics, and also just give you guys an idea of like certain situations you could find yourself in and how to get out of those situations. We've also put steps towards awareness, and we've given practical tools, some words of advice on how you can navigate these types of situations in your day-to-day life.
Okay, so we're going to first get into understanding bias and attribution theory. So, attribution theory is defined as a theory that attempts to determine the cause of behavior. So, what that pretty much entails, what according to bias, is bias is pretty much bias is pretty much the tendency to categorize based on assumptions. So, that also leads to categorization, that leads to, an unfair outlook or an unfair perception of other people and other groups of people, according to, what history has prevailed. European American dominant groups have been um, the dominant groups in society. So everybody else has been looked at or frowned upon, which is obviously what we're here to discuss, and that's not okay. Also, we can talk about because so there's four different subcategories as bias. There is prejudice, there's discrimination, and there's stereotyping. So bias would be um, um, next slide. So understanding bias and attribution theory would be um, um, I'm sorry. Um, yeah.
An example of this that I could add on is, for example, somebody could be late to work, and automatically we create the assumption, or we start thinking that they're lazy, or um they just didn't feel like showing up, instead of us automatically just thinking that they could have had a personal emergency. This process is impacted by our existing beliefs and stereotypes in day-to-day life. So the next topic we'll be looking at is defining stereotypes. So stereotypes are oversimplified beliefs that are generally perpetuated in our day-to-day lives. Common examples are like in the media. Stereotypes are generalized beliefs about a group of people that are not true. These beliefs can be harmful because they ignore individual differences and usually based on limited or distort information. An example of this could be that all Asian kids are good in math. That is a statement that is not true, but it has been perpetuated within our society because normally a lot of Asian students that you do meet are often good in math because they have different systems back in their student curriculum that emphasize or put an emphasis on mathematics and being extremely good in it. So this would be an example of a stereotype that it's not true to all Asian kids and it is wrong to bring it up. So Gordon Alporto in The Nature of Prejudice explains that while categorization is a basic cognitive function, stereotypes become dangerous when they're rigid and resistant to new information. So this means that now that we have information and an understanding that not all Asian kids are good in math, as a society, we need to be willing to change and understand that that is a harmful stereotype.
So prejudice is going to be our next topic, and this goes further as it is looked at as an attitude or a preconceived judgment or feeling. Usually, it's negative towards someone of their group membership. It also is rooted in emotion, not facts. It can exist without direct action. So like I mentioned, it is on a preconceived judgment or feeling. This includes emotional reactions, which could include fear, disgust, or resentment. And it could also have cognitive distortions like beliefs in group inferiority. It could also have behavioral tendencies like a desire to avoid or exclude certain groups in their memberships. I wanted to touch upon Gordon Allport's explanation of prejudice and defining it as an antipathy based upon a faulty and inflexible generalization. So pretty much saying that prejudice is not innate, but it is a socially learned aspect. Could either be from your parents, could be from your peers, the media, or institutions. It also is different from discrimination because it is a behavior that follows that follows an example of that would be prejudice might be feeling uncomfortable around someone because of their background or their ethnicity. Even if you don't act upon that feeling, it's something that you feel inside, or like I said, a resentment or a disgust toward that particular person because of their background or their group membership. Next slide. I can't. Yeah. So prejudice versus discrimination. So that you can hold a prejudice and you can never act on it, or you can discriminate without consciously feeling prejudice. Or how I like to put it, intent doesn't equal impact. So this is how the difference between the two, and they. It's just pretty much one is a feeling and one is the action. So when we talk about discrimination, we talk about segregational laws, or we talk about racial slurs and hate crimes. This also is playing into overt and covert racism, which we'll get to in a few slides forward. But it also is unfair treatment of individuals or groups based on characteristics such as race, gender, age, and religion. Occurs in 3 levels. It could be individual, it could be institutional, or it could be systemic. And we could pretty much say, like I mentioned before, that that could be overt, like pretty much racism that you can see or that you can hear. Not so much like the opposite, which would be covert, which would be hidden or indirect or unconscious, implicit uh, biases, biases. Um, and yeah, so that's that.
Okay. Next on discrimination, as David explained, discrimination is the action. So, discrimination in action. Discrimination is biased behavior, unequal treatment based on group membership, examples, housing, or jobs. An example of discrimination could be, sorry, hold on. An example of discrimination could refer to a hiring manager constantly overlooking an overqualified candidate because of their racial group, which is very harmful because although the candidate is qualified and meets the requirements that and the standards that the company and the business want them to meet, on the other hand, their race or their religion could play a factor into the hiring manager discriminating against them, and this is not great. Discrimination happens when prejudice translates into actions, and also in the previous slides, we learned more about what prejudice is. So racism, overt and covert. Overt racism is open and intentional, like we stated earlier on, whereas covert racism is hidden and unintentional. Overt racism is intentional and it's like hate speech. So an example is somebody saying that I don't like all white people. That would be an example of a form of like overt racism. It's out there, whereas like covert racism could be something subtle, like all different racial groups sitting with one another during break or during recess, and that division could be because they relate in their own way, but sometimes it's because certain groups have all these preconceived notions that have been created around one another's religious groups or ethnic groups, so it's very subtle. You don't really, it's not always verbal, but it's heavily felt and it can cause a negative impact.
So racism, covert and overt, like my partner had just mentioned, the overt would be the intentional and the open form of racism, and covert would be like the unconscious or indirect or the hidden aspects of it. So that would maybe imply less eye contact, like assumptions that someone is not qualified because of their name or their appearance. And we can pretty much say that it's subtle, the covert aspect of it, and it could make people really feel singled out. It could really affect them in the long run, in the long term scheme of things. I'm pretty sure we can think of multiple times in our lifetimes where we've maybe experienced it or we've seen it. And you know, it's something that's become very ingrained in our society, and it's a shame that that's the case, because you know, obviously it's not right, and you know, people, you know, have been severely affected by it, and you know, I just, yeah, I don't know.
So modern racism and microaggressions. So modern racism is subtle and everyday insults. It's often unconscious, so people don't even realize that they are either receiving this type of treatment or giving out this type of treatment. It is extremely harmful when it's accumulative because sometimes as a person of color, certain things could be said, and majority of the time if you can tell if something is innocent or not. I will often just let it go because I can see that it's not conscious, and the person is unaware, so I will take the time to just educate them but not really be harsh or angry. But when it becomes accumulative, it can become harmful because after educating someone, why are you still repeating the same behavior? So modern racism and microaggressions. Microaggressions are brief and common verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. For example, telling an African student you speak English so well should suggest that foreigners can't really speak great English. And that's just something I've also experienced in like the school setting, for people to be like, oh, you express yourself so eloquently. And it's like, yes, English is my first language. I do speak other languages, but this also just to go to show the representation that people have of Africa, that like we're in the safari or in the deserts. But no, I lived in the city. We have cities, and I went to a private institution and I learned everything in English from the minute I started school. But a lack of education and also not being informed can also push us into perpetuating these narratives. So yet again, this was also an opportunity when I experienced modern racism or any type of microaggression to honestly stand up for myself, and also educate people not only about modern racism and microaggression, but also to educate them on my world and to rectify the false narrative that medias push out of what Africa looks like. And in Blind Spot by Banjani and Greenwald, the authors explore how these biases are embedded in our unconscious minds, making them especially tricky to confront. Okay.
So next, we're going to get into Peggy McIntosh and white privilege. I want to discuss this powerful and often uncomfortable concept in multicultural psychology, which is white privilege. I do want to take a quote that she had actually written in her work, which is, "I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group." So she pretty much gets into her work of white privilege, stating that we are pretty much white people or people of that group are given an unearned advantage as white people because they benefit simply because of their race. These are not necessarily things white people ask for or even are aware of, but rather structural benefits that are woven into the fabric of institutions, norms, and cultural practices in societies where whiteness is the dominant racial identity. So when she describes it as an invisible, weightless knapsack of assets, so that could be like tools or maps, passports, code books that white people carry with them every day without realizing it. So there are pretty much 26 everyday advantages she experienced as a white person. And I can go into some of those experiences now that she had mentioned. Pretty much saying I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. If I turn on the television or open to see the front page of the newspaper, I will see people of my race widely represented. Or I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect on my race. So what's powerful here, I feel like to mention, is that these privileges are often invisible to those who have them, but glaringly obvious to those who don't. So, people who are white or identify as white, or who are white, I should say, not identify, they don't see these invisible advantages that they're given, because it's like automatically given to them because of their race or their color, and it's kind of like not an entitlement, but sort of kind of like that. Like you feel like entitled because of your race and because of what society has deemed was the dominant race, over history and what have you. Like it says, recognizing privilege is a first step toward equity or equality. I feel like that is, people just need to have awareness, and like we need to be more cognitively and socially aware of other people's identities and other people's races, and we need to kind of include that into a whole collective dynamic where everybody is looked at the same, and everybody can feel like they have these advantages, and not just white people.
Well said. Consequences of racism for everyone. So there's a common misconception that racism only affects the victim, but in reality, racism affects both parties negatively. It hurts the victim in a mental way. It can cause various types of mental health issues such as stress and post-traumatic disorder. And perpetrators are also hurt in the sense that if it's unconscious, they are unaware, and it's a difficult thing to navigate. To offend someone and not really understand the magnitude of your offense could also be very harmful to you as a person. But it also harms the environment that the perpetrators are in, because that means there's a lack of education and a lack of understanding the impacts that you're having on society with this type of ideology and this type of thinking. So I just wanted to educate you guys on the fact that racism does affect both parties, whether it be a negative impact, but well, it would obviously be negative, but it impacts society as a whole. Racism harms both targets and the society as a whole. Targets may experience depression, anxiety, and even physical health issues due to chronic stress. Perpetrators are also affected, like I just stated, and not just through social consequences, but by living with fear and also distrust. Claude Steele in Whistling Villa, I don't know how to pronounce that, but that's my source, discusses stereotype thread, the idea that people underperform when they fear conforming negative stereotypes about their groups. So we have an interactive prompt that the both of us are gonna sort of speak to you guys about, that we'd love for you guys to take a look into. So since we've basically stated our key points, we want you guys to implement and apply everything that we've just kind of spoken about, even with the brief examples we've given you in terms of what you would do in this situation. And this prompt was put there to help you guys understand that, like, it is the smallest things and they happen around us, and if not to us. So the scenario is that a racial joke is made in class. How would you respond? What bias is at play? So we'll give you guys 3 minutes to sort of think about this and give us your answer. In the next slide, David will explain to you the best way to go about this type of scenario. You guys have 1 more minute to sort of figure out your answer before we move on to the next slide.
Okay. Okay, so it should be enough time for you guys to maybe have some critical thinking on the answer to this question. So the answer to this question, if a racial if a racial joke was made in class, how would you respond? And what types of what types of racism or what have you would be the answer to this, and it would pretty much be all of it. All types of racism, implicit bias, stereotyping, microaggression, modern and covert racism. It any way that you would look at the perspective of this, it would be any type of racism. If you were to laugh, if you were to feel some type of way about it, if you were to in your mind think about it, but not like physically or like openly respond to it. It's all a form of racism. It's all a form of discrimination. It's all a form of bias and everything that we've been talking about here. So I suppose the action that could follow this would be to be speaking up respectively, explain the harm that it has done. So if people are offended by this, if they were to just keep quiet about it, there would be no awareness, there'd be no speaking up about it. So there would be no change. And what would need to happen from there is there would need to be change from that. Because if somebody does something wrong, they make a joke, let's say, for this example, if nobody speaks up and nobody reprimands them for that action, then they're going to think that it's okay. So they're just going to keep doing it, and it's just going to keep happening. So if you follow up privately or with the teacher if needed, if it gets to the point where it's, out of control, or like the person is, showing signs that they want to harm somebody, or they want to push it to that level, then like that's when you would bring it up to an authoritative figure like a teacher, or somebody in the law or what have you, to kind of nip that in the butt and just sort of move forward from that, because that's how things get changed. Is they yeah
Alrighty. So next up, after discussing all our key points, I would like to mention a few steps towards awareness and change. And change is very uncomfortable and a very difficult thing to navigate. So I know it's not easy for whoever's on the receiving end or whoever's on the giving end, but the points that I've put together are very important and essential to kind of remember in your everyday today life while kind of operating in society, that even though you may not be impacted, what can you do to add change and to make the world a better place, not only for yourself, but for everyone living around it? So my first point, well, our first point was to acknowledge privilege. This is a very uncomfortable one for somebody who is on the other end of not necessarily having certain privileges and stuff because of the color of my skin. But acknowledging privilege has been something that my friends and my peers and my teammates have done in situations where they could see certain things happening to me, and they use their white privilege to protect me, whether it be us outside at a restaurant and I, experience some sort of microaggression. They've always spoken up because it is more impactful when another person of privilege speaks to another person of privilege. And it's also effective because there's a similar form of understanding, and it's best for the two parties to kind of like address each other and to
mm-hmm.
explain everything. And
Mm-hmm.
then the second one, educate yourself and others. Even though I am from a place of no privilege in a sense, although the world is a better place, I would say that I still educate myself on different cultural groups too. So I'm able to understand their point of views. I'm able to understand and unlearn certain biases that I've learned growing up about certain groups of people. So educating yourself on different cultural groups, on different music, on different foods, and also understanding how different cultural groups don't have the same privileges as you, and why those groups don't have those privileges is also a big factor. But in educating yourself, make sure to educate others around you, because we are a product of our environment. So you can educate your siblings, your parents, your immediate family, teammates, colleagues, or classmates. It could be a plethora of people. It doesn't really necessarily have to just be people you interact with on your day-to-day life, but sometimes a person will only learn something from you, and they're not going to go up and read it or search up about it. So word of mouth is also something that's very powerful. And to also educate someone on these types of uncomfortable topics that is closer to you lands better than a person that they don't know, because people can be very defensive and it can also turn into something big and unsafe. And then speak out against injustice. In the society we live in, speaking up is very important. It's important for your voice to be heard. It's important for your perspective to also be heard. But it is important for us to use our voices together. And speaking out against injustice is often hard because sometimes, there's gray areas when it comes to the ideas and freedoms of on and ideas when it comes to the idea of freedom of speech. But speaking out against it, you can protect somebody, just like the scenario, the case study classroom scenario that we had. You can educate someone by speaking up, and you can also save somebody else by just speaking up against injustice. Because oftentimes different privileged groups, often Eurocentric groups, have more privilege and have more weight when they speak up. So it's important that it's not just the minority groups speaking up, but all of us speaking up to make the world a better place and to also educate people on how harmful these ideologies are. A summary of our key points, definitions. We went through bias, stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And in the beginning of our slide, we had put an arrow to show that all of these are interconnected to one another. We learned about modern racism and white privilege. We learned about commitment and equity. Change begins with awareness. When you recognize your bias, especially the unconscious ones. Read works by authors of color, attend cultural events. For instance, at my school, at Ferrum College, we have something called the Cultural Fair, where all international students get an opportunity to set up tables. And we set up these tables with boards that explain five key points and five interesting points about our country that people know, but we also add additional stuff that we know people wouldn't know, because people always know the main stuff, but there's often a lot of misconceptions about people's cultures that people don't know about because they're not living their everyday to day lives, or they've not been to the country, or it's being portrayed very differently from the actual true experience. So attending cultural fairs as an international student, I had to be there, but I went through all the different countries that we had, and we had different types of continents there. So it was very educational for me. I learned a lot of things when it comes to language, when it comes to food. I also saw a lot of similarities amongst different types of European and African groups versus the American group. So it was very interesting to kind of understand and learn about different types of cultures. And it's okay to be uncomfortable because that's where growth happens. Like David explained, that if we need change to happen, we need to do something. So we also added something called the implicit association test. It was done through Harvard, by Harvard, which reveals hidden biases. So this is the implicit associations test, the IAT for short, and it's from Harvard, and it's a psychological tool. So before we get started, I just want to mention that we have attached a link at the bottom, and we've also attached the option that you will pick when you go take this test. But we'd like for every class member to participate. We don't want to see your results publicly, but I think that this is a great tool to help you guys understand and also to reveal certain things that we do unconsciously. And hopefully it's not insensitive. This is nothing but an educational tool that helps us just realize that maybe, we're not really who we think we are, and maybe there are certain ideologies that have kind of like influenced how we see other groups of people. So I will let David explain the rest of the slide.
Okay. So, yeah, the implicit back. Is it the next slide?
Yes, it's the how it works.
um, the test, how the test works. So it pretty much will the results will pretty much tell you what kind of internal biases you have. So that's why we kind of want you to keep the results to yourself, but it can kind of help you learn um, in the future, like how you may look at different groups of people or dominant. I mean, or like. Not so dominant groups of people in the world. And you can kind of use what we've taught you here today, hopefully, to maybe look at yourself and maybe have a different perception on how you see others, or the feelings that you may have or that you've been grown up to feel. Maybe you could change them or become more aware of it. And that we specifically chose one topic or one subsection, which would be Asian American, but you could do any of the other ones if you so well please, and if you wanted to, and that could definitely make you see the big picture of how you would not just look at one group of people, but like how you could look at other groups of people that may have been, that may be insensitive for you know us to have presented today.
And
But
the test looks at the time you take, your reaction time, and it will also pop up a bunch of images, and you have to choose which image you prefer, or which image you attach to a particular idea. And the test will switch combinations halfway through. So basically, that's just a general idea of how the test works and why you need to do the test, and the importance of the test, and certain things that the test is going to reveal. So that is the end of our presentation. We hope that this was an educational presentation, although some of the topics and examples could have been uncomfortable. Those were not our intentions. Our intentions was to simply educate one another and to learn and grow, and also just become better individuals of society, especially with the gift of education and the ability to learn.
thank you.
Thank you. Hold on, I'm trying to figure out how I stop recording.
um
Oh, pause. Did it
Maybe
stop?
it's still on.
It says you're
You
is
have,
it still recording?
yeah, I think so.
But I paused it. It's paused on my end.
Request
Pause.
control.
Stop
You're